In April 1997, the United States Air Force celebrated the 50th anniversary of its creation with a magnificent air show held at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. On display at Nellis were the aircraft of today's US Air Force. They included the B-2 stealth bomber. Also thrilling the crowd were the General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon multi-role fighter. Douglas F-15 Strike and Air Superiority Fighter. That veteran of the Cold War, the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird spy plane. The mighty Boeing B-52 bomber thundered past the mass of spectators. Alongside America's modern combat planes were such World War II veterans as the P-47 Thunderbolt. P-51 Mustangs, and that other mainstay of the US Army Air Force, the P-38 Lightning. There were two America's frontline heavy bombers of the war, the B-24 Liberator and the B-17 Flying Fortress. They recalled the cold-blooded courage of those who flew them on missions over hostile territory. This Lockheed C-69, the Constellation airliner in its civilian guise, commemorated the crews who flew over the mountains from India to China to keep her supplied in her war against Japan. But even earlier aircraft were on display, with the DH-4 Liberty plane symbolizing the Army Air Service's flying of the US airmail in the 1920s, and the 1914-18 British SE-5, which was flown by some American fighter pilots in France. If all this was not enough to thrill the vast number of spectators attending the USAF's 50th birthday, there were also aerobatic display teams from a number of countries. Set against a magnificent mountain backcloth, the US Air Force's 50th anniversary celebration was an outstanding success. Air shows have been with us since almost the dawn of powered flight. In the early days, they gave ordinary people the opportunity to witness and marvel at the new adventure that flying an aircraft was. After the Great War, air shows reflected the atmosphere of the time. Air power had come of age during 1914-18, and air forces like Britain's Royal Air Force and the Italian Air Force were struggling to preserve their independence from armies and navies. They therefore used air shows to instill air-mindedness in the general public and to encourage it to support their independence. Among the most famous was the RAF's Air Pageant, which was held annually at Hendon, on the outskirts of London, throughout the interwar period. So popular was this event, which displayed the RAF's might and flying skills to the full, that it became part of the London season, together with Royal Ascot, the Henley Regatta, and other notable summer sports events. Air forces like the US Air Service, which became the Army Air Corps in 1926, used air shows in their struggle for independence. But the 1920s were dubbed the Jazz Age, when young people threw off all restraints in their efforts to forget the bloody slaughter of 1914-18. Speed and danger served to fuel their excitement. This lust for thrills of every sort spread into aviation, with audiences expecting endless novelty. This daring French pilot set the trend by flying through Paris's Arc de Triomphe in July 1919 to celebrate the signing of peace. In America, this craziness resulted in the Barnstormers, daredevil pilots who would compete with one another to pull off the maddest stunt. Who in their right mind would perform this trick?
But here's a thrill that wasn't on the program. Watch the plane.
One form of this type of air spectacle was wing walking. So popular did wing walking become that the climax of the 1933 film musical Flying Down to Rio, which saw the beginning of the famous Fred Astaire-Ginger Rogers partnership, was the famous aerial ballet sequence. But while barnstorming and wing walking were very much creatures of the 20s and 30s, they still thrill today.
Comes into the air show center at 165 miles per hour all the way around in the Barnstormer's loop, pulling 4 G's at the bottom. Now as he comes through again, he's, holy cow, what's he doing? Look out, Bob, around it goes again. Once again, up to the loop.
Tricks like this might seem mad, but they demand the highest flying skills. air races were another popular spectacle of the interwar years. Contests like America's Bendix Trophy and Britain's King's Cup made front-page news, but other air spectacles were more sinister. The interwar years also saw air shows being used as political propaganda platforms. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini loved to see his air force perform. Adolf Hitler revealed his secretly created Luftwaffe to the world in 1935. Massed flypasts by combat aircraft served as a warning to neighboring countries not to frustrate his aim of making Germany great again. Joseph Stalin, too, used the Red Air Force to demonstrate the power of communism. This was both to foreign countries and to the Russian people, who flocked to the impressive flying displays staged at Suchino Airport outside Moscow. But while simulated bombing might make spectators marvel at and be thrilled by the growing power of military aviation, within a few years many millions of people would have to endure attacks from the air for real. After 1945, the leading air shows became very much a shop window for aircraft manufacturers. This was especially in Western Europe, where the plane makers were keen to re-establish overseas markets after the ravages of the war. Thus, the first post-war show at Farnborough, England, had a wide range of British aircraft. But the show also included flying displays by captured German aircraft, including the Heinkel HE-162 Salamander jet and the Messerschmitt Me-262. The flying displays at today's international air shows are crucial to sales. The pilot has only a limited amount of sky in which to show his aircraft at its best. A Canadian F-18 pilot explains the concept behind his display.
On the way up on the loop, I'm flying between 10 and 12 degrees alpha, or angle of attack, and holding that to look to come at the top of the loop with 3,500 feet above ground. From there, I'm looking outside at the ground and playing the remainder of the turn to recover between 300 and 400 feet above the ground level. I'll reposition off of that via a split S maneuver and come back in for my square loop, which I think personally is one of the best aspects of the show.
With the end of the Cold War in 1989, there was great excitement in the West when the Russians began to display their latest combat jets, like the MiG-29, NATO codename Fulcrum. Another was a Sukhoi Su-27 flanker, whose spectacular tail slide maneuver caused particular excitement. The pilots at international air shows are displaying their aircraft, whether they be fast jets and helicopters, airliners at the outer limits of their performance. Hence, the test pilots on a particular aircraft are usually the ones who do the displays, since they have intimate knowledge of its handling characteristics. Sometimes, however, things do go wrong. At the 1952 Farnborough Air Show, John Derry, the first Briton to fly faster than sound, was demonstrating the second prototype of the twin-tail, twin-engine de Havilland DH-110 jet. It had flown perfectly for most of the week, in front of a large and admiring audience. On the 6th of September, Derry took up the first prototype, because the second needed maintenance. His performance began well. Derry now began his low-level routine, but as he swept towards the stands, his wings buckled and the aircraft disintegrated. Not only were Derry and his observer killed, but 226 spectators as well. Many more were injured and rushed to a hospital, still not quite comprehending what had happened to them. Luckier, though, was Anatoly Kvatscher at the 1989 Paris Air Show. The starboard engine of his MiG-29 cut out, but he managed to eject just 2 seconds before his aircraft smashed into the ground. At the 1984 Farnborough Air Show, this de Havilland Canada Buffalo got into difficulties. However, the resultant fire quickly went out, and the crew were able to walk away, thus dramatically demonstrating how robust this aircraft is. But there is a very special breed of display pilot whose performances are guaranteed to thrill. Purpose-built aerobatics aircraft like the American-designed Pitts Special family can perform maneuvers that few other aircraft are capable of. Equally as renowned are the Czech Zlin series, with the Zlin 50 dominating the world of aerobatics in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Yet aerobatics, like air shows themselves, began well before 1914, as pilots sought to establish the flight performance limits of their machines. During the Great War of 1914-18, aerobatics, or stunting as it was called, were vital to a fighter pilot's effectiveness and indeed survivability, as leading American ace Eddie Rickenbacker demonstrated for the camera. In the 1920s, aerobatics became a major airshow attraction.
Biesler on the left, Germany's war ace, meets the Frenchman de Troyer. The German takes off first. Into a spin, an old wartime dodge, tricked his opponent into thinking he'd lost control. Now the crowd's keyed up to see the Frenchman perform. De Troyer was only a boy during the war. Now he's considered the best stunt pilot on the continent. We shall soon see.
By now, there were standard aerobatic evolutions. These included the loop, the bunt, the stall, the roll, and the spin. Pilots then developed ever more ambitious and spectacular variations of these.
Yes, the throttle has one position, wide open. Rudder comes in very heavily on all the flick manoeuvres, that's the very, very rapid rotations. And there's an 8-point roll at low level. As you can see, it's full control deflection and no messing. There was really nothing very much gentle about these aerobatics in this sort of aircraft.
Aerobatics briefly became an Olympic sport at the 1936 Berlin Games, with the host nation, Germany, winning the gold medal. Nowadays, however, the top aerobatic pilots, both men and women, compete in the biennial World Aerobatics Championships, which were established in 1960. Pilots perform within an imaginary box in the sky. Its base is 100 meters above the ground, and it's 1,000 meters in both length and breadth and 900 meters in height. If the competitors fly outside the box, they incur penalty points. In the World Championships, the competitors fly 3 programs, one with 14 compulsory figures. The second is a freestyle program designed by the competitor to best demonstrate his or her aerobatic skills. Finally, the competitors have to perform 12 maneuvers from a list drawn up by the International Aerobatics Association. Judging is based on the precision and quality of each figure, with the degree of difficulty taken into account. So rigorous is the judging that a perfect score of 10 is almost impossible to achieve. The World Aerobatics Championships are indeed a very severe test, with the aircraft reaching speeds of over 200 miles per hour and the pilots experiencing G-forces equivalent to 8 times their body weight as they strive to perform the most difficult and perfect maneuvers within the narrow confines of the box. But even more impressive and thrilling for the air show spectator than the solo aerobatics displays are those given by formation teams. Formation flying grew up during 1914-18 as a means of controlling groups of aircraft in the air and to enable them to protect one another. During the 1920s, with the incorporation of aerobatics, Formation flying quickly developed into an aviation art form, as well as a means of perfecting the skills of fighter pilots. Formation aerobatics were significantly enhanced by the development of air-to-air radio in the 1930s.
All right, gentlemen, roll. Hold your V formation. Ready, Evan? Ready, Morgan? All right, let's go.
But sometimes things went badly wrong. This happened during this display by the US Navy in its Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers. After the Second World War, jets, like the British Gloucester Meteor, began to be used for formation aerobatics. Nowadays, many air forces have aerobatics display teams. They include the US Air Force's Thunderbirds, the US Navy's Blue Angels, and the Royal Air Force's Red Arrows. There are also numerous civilian aerobatics teams. Helicopters too perform formation aerobatics. One of the most graceful displays is two Fournier RF-4 motor gliders. Team aerobatics has its own terminology for its formations and maneuvers. Typical formations include Apollo, Delta, Half Swan, Wine Glass, Concorde, and King's Cross. Some of the popular maneuvers are demonstrated by the Thunderbirds, the Diamond Pass and Review, Solo 360 with half Cuban, bon ton rule? The Calypso pass and finally the high bomb burst.
Good afternoon. First night shift.
For a team like the RAF's Red Arrows, working up a routine needs many weeks of practice.
Days are serviceable, 2:30-12, all crowd left, down the strip. Then we'll now fly a full first half. Now, for the three new chaps who haven't done this before, the things you'll find, it's no big deal about it at all. There's nobody really watching us. It's not a proper display. It's just a practice like any other practice. And if you do make a minor error, don't let it affect you for the rest of the sortie, okay? This is the first nine shift. I don't expect it to be immaculate. Enjoy.
Captain, good morning. Red Arrows taxi.
Red Arrows, good morning. Taxi for 23 right hand, QRB 1026. The surface wind west of the 8 knots. 2,000 foot wind, 33020.
Go park. Pilots. Reds running now.
The pilots of the Red Arrows Hawk trainers have got to develop absolute trust in one another. They cannot allow their attention to wander for a split second. The team members must be absolutely precise in their flying.
Come on, Jay, I'll get it in. Go on, sir, go on. Smoke off, start. Oh.
The team begins to settle down.
Six, seven.
As with many other things in life, practice makes perfect. Yet however hard the team works at its display, there is always the danger of an accidental split-second miscalculation. The Italian Air Force's Frecce Tricolori team suffered this during a display at a NATO air show held at the USAF base at Ramstein in Germany in August 1988. It was a thrilling display, which seemed to be going perfectly. The team now split into three, with the lead pilot flying off on his own. The two groups prepared to cross. The lead pilot flew in to intersect the crossing groups at right angles. Three team members and 30 spectators were killed, with many others injured. The pilots of the display teams are well aware of the risks involved, but their confidence in their flying skills and each other, as well as the pride that they take in putting on a perfect performance, ensures that they will continue to thrill audiences around the world. Another major attraction at any air show is a display of vintage aircraft, especially if they fly. For British audiences, there is nothing more moving than the sight of the RAF's historic flight, which is made up of 3 aircraft which symbolized the RAF's part in the Second World War. The Avro Lancaster bomber is one. The others are those 2 heroes of the Battle of Britain, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire, seen here with its successor of 50 years on, the Panavia Tornado. There is also in Britain a unique collection of aircraft which covers the first 40 years of heavier-than-air powered flight. It was started by one of Britain's leading racing drivers of the 1930s, who also learned to fly. This was Richard Shuttleworth, winner of the 1935 British Grand Prix, who was killed flying with the RAF in 1940. The Shuttleworth collection now boasts over 40 aircraft, both civil and military. Most of them still fly. The earliest is a Blériot Type 11 of 1909, very similar to the aircraft in which the French aviator Louis Blériot made his famous first flight of the English Channel in that same year. Aviation history is truly coming alive. There are also some classic aircraft of 1914-18, including 2 famous replica German fighters, the Fokker Eindecker of 1915 and the 1917 Fokker triplane. The 1920s and 1930s are also well represented. The American equivalent to the Shuttleworth collection is the Confederate Air Force, which is made up of several chapters and has a large number of historic aircraft. The Confederate Air Force performs at numerous air shows across the United States. Apart from its extensive collection of Second World War aircraft, the force also has planes from other eras, including the Russian MiG-15 and the North American F-86 Sabre. The mock battles between these 2 types bring alive the Korean War, when jet versus jet combat first became a reality. another spectacular Confederate Air Force reenactment is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor of the 7th of December 1941. The Confederate Air Force also has a complete flying collection of American World War II bombers, which bring back memories of the strategic air offensives against Germany and Japan. But many of the historic aircraft flying today are the fruits of sometimes years of painstaking and devoted restoration work. Bringing historic aircraft back to life sometimes begins with aviation archaeologists locating a wreck. In this case, a Hurricane, shot down off the south coast of England in August 1940 during the Battle of Britain. These discoveries can be very poignant. In 1996, a farmer in the southwestern Chinese province of Xinjiang stumbled across the wreckage of an American B-24 Liberator in the mountains. The bomber probably belonged to the US 12th Air Force, which operated in the China-Burma-India theater during the war. The farmer had also found the remains of the crew, and so a team from the US Missing in Action, MIA office, flew to China to investigate. The crew members were identified and could finally be laid to rest over 50 years after they had been posted as missing. This was thanks to the surprisingly good condition of their personal equipment and effects, but especially due to the identity tags which they had been wearing. But one of the most spectacular finds was in Scotland's Loch Ness, home of the fabled monster. Using a remote underwater camera, the aviation archaeologists located the wreck of a Second World War Vickers Wellington bomber. The plane was instantly recognizable from the unique geodetic or lattice fuselage construction, which made it a very tough aircraft. Recovering the Wellington from the bottom of the loch was a challenge. Incredibly, the team got it to the surface virtually intact. Even the lights still worked. The machine gun ammunition was in perfect condition. The Wellington bomber had been the mainstay of RAF Bomber Command during the first part of the war, but none had been preserved in flying condition, making this find all the more significant. Once recovered, the painstaking business of putting the aircraft back together begins. In this case, a Kingfisher seaplane, which was the eyes of so many US warships during World War II. Often this entails calling on the help of those involved in the original production of the aircraft. But the thrill of seeing a fully restored aircraft come alive again, like this British Second World War Blenheim bomber, makes the months and years of toil all the more worthwhile. Keeping such an aircraft in an airworthy state also involves considerable hard work. But those who carry this out regard it as a true labor of love. It is therefore a major tragedy when one of these preserved aircraft, like this World War II American A-26 Invader medium bomber, comes to grief at an airshow. For preserved or replica historic aircraft represent the living history of aviation. Some, like this replica of the Wright brothers flyer, which made that very first powered flight in 1903, recall aviation's most epic moments. In this instance, it enables us to establish exactly how Orville and Wilbur Wright were able to achieve controlled flight. Symbolically positioned by an Anglo-French Concorde supersonic airliner, this life-size model of a Ryan aircraft called the Spirit of St. Louis commemorates that very first solo flight across the Atlantic by Charles Lindbergh in May 1927. Another replica aircraft, the Vickers Vimy, recalls two more famous flights, both of which took place in 1919. One is the very first flight across the Atlantic by Britain's Alcock and Brown. The other is the Smith brothers' first flight from England to Australia, which this aircraft reenacted in 1994. Thus, flying as a spectacle takes many forms and continues to thrill us as much as it did our forebears at the beginning of this century. Indeed, air displays remain a celebration of one of humanity's greatest technological achievements, and one which is ongoing. But the centerpiece of any air show will always be formation aerobatics, since this encapsulates more than anything else the sheer joy of flight.